Hello and welcome. Thank you for joining us today for our Farm Foundation Forum, The Next 4 Years in Ag Policy. We're so glad you've joined us today to engage with our wonderful set of panelists. My name is Sherry Rogie-Fiddler, and I'm the President and CEO of Farm Foundation, located just outside of Chicago, Illinois. I am also a fifth-generation farm owner-operator from Nebraska. And as someone with deep roots in agriculture, who is both personally and professionally invested in our food and agricultural system, I'm excited to hear from our experts today about what they think may be on the horizon for U.S. ag policy and how that may affect the diverse stakeholders in rural and urban areas across our food system. I'd like to begin by telling you a bit more about Farm Foundation. We are an accelerator of practical solutions for agriculture, accelerating people and ideas into action. There are 3 levers we use in our theory of change: policy, innovation, and education. We're a 501c3 nonprofit and rely on partnerships to fund our work. If you're interested in learning more about funding or partnering with us in any of these areas, I invite you to reach out to explore collaboration. You can also learn more by connecting with us on several different social media platforms you see here and on our website at farmfoundation.org. One more note, if you're posting on social media today, as we hope you will, please use hashtag FarmFoundationForum. So as we get underway with today's forum, I'd like to quickly go over just a few housekeeping notes. You may submit questions by clicking on the Q&A button on the bottom of your screen. And when submitting your questions, please include your name and organization so questions may be contextually understood. Due to time limits, the moderator may not be able to ask all questions submitted. We hope you'll understand that. This forum is being recorded and will be posted on our website at farmfoundation.org. If there happen to be any connectivity issues during the forum, we ask that you stay on the forum as they generally rectify themselves just after a few moments. And when the forum concludes, you'll receive a link to a very short survey, and Farm Foundation really appreciates your feedback and your time in completing it. So before we dive in, I'd like to take just a moment to share our vision for today's forum. As we prepare for a new presidential administration, we must also prepare for the policy changes we may see as a result. Bringing together expert voices to discuss these changes ties directly into Farm Foundation's mission of building trust and understanding at the intersections of agriculture and society. And as a nonpartisan organization, Farm Foundation is uniquely positioned to convene a variety of viewpoints on the future of U.S. ag policy. In that vein, all former Secretaries of Agriculture are invited to become honorary lifetime fellows of our Farm Foundation Roundtable program, and all of these fellows were invited to participate in today's panel. We are delighted that 3 former secretaries were able to join us today. Former Secretary Tom Vilsack was unable to join us today due to scheduling issues, but plans to engage with us in early 2021 to share some perspectives on the future of animal protein. And while former Secretary Mike Johanns was unable to participate, also due to scheduling constraints, he did ask me to share that he welcomes engaging with our speakers today and the incoming Secretary of Agriculture to support the future of food and ag. He noted that food and agriculture are areas that affect every American, so they are perfectly suited for bipartisan collaboration. In addition to the 3 former secretaries today, we invited an agricultural trade expert, Darcy Vetter, to join the panel because we know one of the biggest issues facing the USDA will continue to be trade, and it is likely to be a major area of discussion today. Darcy is also a Farm Foundation board member and Roundtable Fellow. You'll hear more about all of our panelists in just a moment. We're grateful to have Clinton Griffiths with us as our moderator for today's forum. Clinton is anchor of AgDay television and editor of Farm Journal, and it will be his primary responsibility to guide our panelists through a discussion on a wide range of issues affecting agriculture and what we might expect to see as ag policy priorities from the incoming presidential administration. So at this point, I will turn things over to Clinton to highlight our panelists and to provide an overview of the format for today's discussion. Clinton?
Sherry, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be with all of you. It sounds like we have a great turnout for today's Farm Foundation Forum, looking at the next 4 years of ag policy. And of course, we're joined by some great experts here helping us set the stage. First, these are very short bios, and we'll keep them short for a reason because we want to make sure that we get to all of your questions and all of these topics over the next 90 minutes. We'll start with former Secretary of Agriculture Mike Espy, served under President Bill Clinton from 93 to 94. Former Secretary of Agriculture Dan Glickman, who served under Bill Clinton from 1995 through 2001. Former Ag Secretary Ann Veneman, she served under George W. Bush from 2001 to 2005. And of course, as Sherry mentioned, Darcy Vetter, former Chief Agricultural Negotiator at USTR under President Obama, now the Vice Chair, Agriculture, Food and Trade, and the General Manager of Public Affairs at Edelman. I want to thank all of them for joining us. What we will start with are just a short opening statement from each of our guests, and then let them share their thoughts as we begin to frame this conversation about what the next 4 years under a new administration may look like and how that could impact agricultural policy and overall the food and agricultural industry. And we decided before we began that we would go in alphabetical order by last name. So why don't we welcome Secretary Mike Espy to start us off.
All right, good morning, Clinton, and all of my Farm Foundation friends. I appreciate being here. Thank you, and greetings from Jackson, Mississippi, and particularly to my secretarial colleagues. Thank you so much. It's good to see you. All you guys are looking great. All right, so if the question of all of us would be what we think will be the changes in agricultural policy and what USDA is going to look like the next 4 years, I'll first say it's not going to be much different from what we have now, considering the income and the insurance program that will support income and prices. I think all of those things, all those elements in the current farm bill are going to increase. So I don't see anything revolutionary coming. However, I think there's going to be a renewed focus in 5 areas: COVID, trade, rural development, nutrition, and what I call equity in agriculture. So let me hit all of those very, very quickly. COVID for sure. COVID is ravaging across the United States. It's disrupted a lot of the supply lines here in American agriculture. A lot of our abattoirs, our slaughterhouses have closed because the employees have gotten sick. So if I know anything, I know that Joe Biden and the medical team that he's going to announce today will focus like a laser beam on making sure that all of these food processing plants and those in the food cycle will be COVID compliant. And so all of those federally regulated processing plants that didn't comply or were reticent to comply with CDC guidelines, I think that they're prepared to be debarred if they don't respond to what I think is going to be a very, very intense focus on making sure our food is safe and the employees that process these foods are not infected with COVID-19. Number 2, I'm happy to see that the price is lifting now insofar as corn and soybeans and other grains. But the only way those prices can be sustained is to make sure that we increase trade, particularly to China and to new markets like Cuba that was closed. It was beginning to be open under Obama, and then it was closed. And I think that under Joe Biden and whoever he chooses as the U.S. State Secretary, I think that we're going to have more of a focus on Cuba, and well, we should. I mean, it's 90 miles away, and we're a food superpower. So it just doesn't make any sense that the population of Cuba must depend on China or Canada or Spain, for their beans and for their rice. It makes no sense. And then I think that they're going to use the tariff tool very, very gingerly and not repeat, I think, which were mistakes of this administration, imposing tariffs on aluminum and steel, inviting retaliatory tariffs on soybeans that destroyed the Chinese market for American soybeans. Number 3, very quickly, rural America is suffering. We need more broadband. We need our rural hospitals to remain open. And I think that the Rural Development Administration will take a lead on this more than ever before to make sure our rural communities are healthy and sustainable. Of the $150 billion agriculture budget at USDA, most of it now, unfortunately, is because more people are hungry. So we need more programs to make sure those folks are not as needy. And that goes to rural development programs. But in the meantime, when people are hungry and the food pantries are not full, I think we've got to do more there. And I think that USDA is going to focus on this in the next year, if not the next 4 years. And then lastly, what I call more equity in agriculture. The agriculture industry is getting more concentrated. It's consolidating. That's necessary because of economies of scale. But we should not forget the women farmers, the small farmers, minority farmers. And I think that this administration coming in will make sure that they get consideration. And there's one problem that I see. We have this Farmers to Food Boxes program. It's a necessary program, a $3 billion program, but none of the co-ops, none of the food hubs were made eligible to participate, and that was a mistake. So I think that this next administration over the next 4 years will focus on COVID compliance in agriculture country, expanding trade, rejoining a lot of these multilateral trade treaties that we abandoned, focus on rural development, doing more nutrition, and including more diverse farmers, young farmers, women farmers, minority farmers, and small farmers. That's what I believe. Thank you.
Secretary Espy, thank you so much for kind of kicking us off with some great thoughts, some great comments there. We'll peel that onion back as we go through the rest of our conversation over the next 90 minutes or so. Why don't we go now to former Secretary Dan Glickman, or I guess you're always Secretary Dan Glickman, with some opening statements, opening comments for us.
Thank you. Now you can hear me, right?
Yes, sir.
Okay, I apologize. The most famous words during this period of COVID are "you are on mute." So I've now learned that lesson. Any event, thanks to everybody here, Clinton and Sherry. And I could echo everything that Mike Espy just said and just shut up. But being a former politician, I can't do that. So I at least have to say I agree with everything that Mike has said, but I would add the following. Number one, are we prepared for the next pandemic? If swine flu were to travel around the world, would we even have a vaccine that could take care of this situation? And I say that because we've lost 280,000 people have died as of today with this pandemic. The food chain has been disrupted rather dramatically. And so the first item I would talk about is, are we able to have the funding to do the necessary research over the next 40 years, 5 years, decades to deal with these asteroids that could hit us in the future? This pandemic has been a national security, a food, farm, and agricultural nightmare. And so the first thing I would say for the future is adequate spending for the research agenda to protect farmers, ranchers, consumers, and our food supply generally. Again, and a lot of the research has to go into zoonotics. About 70% of viruses that affect human beings come from animals. And yet we do very, very little research into this whole area of zoonotics. And this is an enormous threat for the human race. And it's an enormous threat for agriculture. So research, adequate research budget. I happen to believe that the research function of USDA is the most important function of the Department of Agriculture. And it just needs to be adequately funded. The second issue, which Mike talked about, is nutrition. Not only ensuring enough money is going into feeding hungry people, but analyzing the science of nutrition to determine what we ought to be eating. And I'm not going to tell people what we should eat, but I will tell you this, that the leading cause of early mortality in this world, early death and disease, is poor nutrition. $160 billion a year is spent on treating people my age with who have type 2 diabetes. And so chronic disease is this huge factor in America. And there has been an evolution in terms of what people ought to eat and how that impacts agriculture. It probably will mean more diversification in agriculture. We're going to have more farmers planting newer and different and more kinds of crops. But I know Ann Veneman and I have worked on this issue and will continue to work on it. This science of nutrition is particularly important. It also ties rural and urban America together much more significantly than we need to do. So that would be the second thing: nutrition, adequate funding, research, and determining how nutrition and health and medicine relate to each other. And the third issue is climate. And if there's anything this administration I think you're going to see is going to focus on is climate writ large, climate having to do with energy, climate having to do with all parts of the economy. But agriculture is a huge part of the science of climate, the science of weather, volatile weather, drought, excessive rainfall, forest fires, and pests and disease, which affects animals and which affects certainly plants as well. And so what we in agriculture need to do is to be a party to all of this, not to fight it, but to participate with it. This is not a political issue, climate change. This is an economic issue of survival for farmers and ranchers. So it means working together across party lines to deal with these issues and to make sure that what we do is sensible, reasonable, practical, and at the same time deal with the long-term health of farmers and ranchers to produce an adequate amount of food. So research, nutrition, climate and weather, that would be my idea of what the future lies for agriculture and how we can best protect it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Secretary. Appreciate you getting us started with your opening thoughts. And why don't we go now to Secretary Ann Veneman and get her thoughts on where we begin the conversation.
Well, thank you very much. And let me say what a privilege it is to be here with the other former secretaries and to share my thoughts on what I think the priority should be as a new Secretary of Agriculture takes the reins of this very important department. Let me start with COVID, and I really echo what the other secretaries have said about the various issues. But I think as we look at COVID, we can't really ignore the fact that we have lines and lines of people waiting for food at food banks. So I think one of the first things a new administration coming into USDA needs to do is look at our authorities. How do we get more people on to the SNAP program so that less people are standing in lines at the food banks? The food box program was mentioned. I'm not sure that's the answer for the long term. It's been very expensive, but that whole program needs to have a close look. On the supply chain issues, as has been mentioned, there were a lot of issues disrupting the supply chain. I think many of us were surprised by how there were different supply chains for out of home versus in home. And so suddenly 50% of the food that was being consumed was out of home, and that supply chain was particularly disrupted and had to pivot to address where food was being consumed. I think that USDA can play a very important role going forward in how to facilitate the discussion about supply chain and how to avoid long disruption of markets in the future. We've also seen a change in consumer buying habits. We've seen acceleration of online purchasing of both groceries and restaurant food delivery. This has led to more, the development of more dark stores and ghost kitchens, another trend that's happening. Then the safety of the workers throughout the food chain has been mentioned, and particularly those in meat and poultry plants, which of course USDA is responsible for inspecting. The USDA meat inspectors have not been impacted as have been the workers. So they've become infected. They've complained of lack of PPE. And a story in the media just last week highlighted concerns that USDA meat inspectors lack access to testing and are being asked to work even after they've been exposed. So I think that's something the new secretary needs to look at. And of course, when the meat and poultry plants have had to shut down, that's impacted the farmers who are providing the product and forced the euthanization of some animals, as we saw early in the pandemic. I think there's also a need to look at how do we get more smaller meat plants for the customers that are now buying their own products. There's also been a big problem with farm workers and packing houses, particularly here in California where I am, and both how they're working and how they're living as farm workers have impacted the COVID. In addition, I think there needs to be a focus on rural development because of the lack of broadband in rural areas. It's forced children who are trying to learn over Zoom instead of in the classroom. They've had more difficulty because of lack of good broadband. It's hurting the business development and remote work in rural communities. And of course, it impacts health and telehealth. And the rural development programs also need to be looked at to improve the rural infrastructure. In addition, we need to be looking at international food programs. This pandemic is not just affecting us in the United States. People all over the world are suffering from more hunger than we've seen in recent years because of the loss of livelihoods due to this pandemic. And so we need to work closely with AID on our food aid programs, along with working with FAO and WFP, World Food Program, to help address these. As Dan Glickman said, the Biden administration, and this is a second big area, is going to focus on climate and the environment. And I think this is going to be something the new secretary is going to have to put a lot of focus on. I have been very encouraged by recent developments of ag and environmental groups coming together to begin to look at common sense solutions and how agriculture can move forward. So the new Food and Agriculture Climate Alliance, or FACA as it's called, it was formed earlier this year, and it's developed 40 recommendations to help shape future policies to make agriculture more environmentally friendly. There's also the U.S. Farmers and Ranchers Alliance, which is doing great work in bringing people together on these issues. And the USDA has a strong role to play in working with these groups to really figure out how do we go forward. I think one thing that has not been mentioned so far is that we also need to not forget that the U.S. Forest Service is in the USDA. I was very affected this summer by all the smoke from the fires out here in California. And we have to work with state forestry organizations and others to really address how to address common sense forest and public lands policy in the future, because the forests are burning at an unprecedented rate. As Dan mentioned, the nutrition issues are just critical. As he said, we work together on them, but we really have to focus on how to put the nutrition into the SNAP program, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. And of course, COVID is exacerbated by diet-related diseases. More people die who have these diseases. The one other area I'd like to, or one of the other areas I'd like to mention is the animal plant health inspection programs, I think are so critical. The 4 years I was in USDA were marked by one emergency after another in this area. I came in the first week, we had to address the huge outbreak of foot and mouth disease in Europe. That was followed, of course, by the events of 9/11, where we had to look at where the threats to the food system were. We had the first outbreak of exotic Newcastle disease in 50 years. We had bird flu, and of course, we had the first case of mad cow disease when I was at USDA. So I can't underscore enough the importance of the animal plant health inspection service issues. I think and I can go into this later, but I think we have to look at new technologies where USDA's regulatory responsibilities will be, with things like cell-based meat, CRISPR technology, the increase in indoor agriculture and so forth. And then of course, trade is a huge issue, and I'll leave that for future discussion with Darcy. So thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Ann. Appreciate getting us started there with your thoughts on this topic. Why don't we turn it over now to Darcy Vetter for her opening statements.
Well, thank you very much, Clinton. I think obviously, first of all, thank you to the Farm Foundation. Thanks to you for moderating today. And really, it is just a pleasure to be able to share the screen, not the stage, I guess, the screen, with 3 former secretaries of agriculture who have had to balance the breadth of issue areas and priorities that are part of what it means to be the Secretary of Ag. And I think they've done a great job of outlining really critical issues that that the next secretary will have to deal with. And I think every one of the issues that were on my sort of list of things to highlight today have already been mentioned. So maybe I will just look a little bit at specifically what sort of levers the secretary could pull, a new Secretary of Agriculture, or how they might integrate that. And I will reiterate just a bit here what others have said, but I think that, you know, Dan made the good point that climate really has been part of the messaging across all of the different government departments for this administration. It's really clearly a cross-cutting issue. And I think as secretary, there's really an opportunity for the new incoming administration, for that person, to think about climate and. So climate and rural development, what does that mean for what we look at in terms of rural energy or rural housing programs, and how can we make those more climate friendly? Climate and our conservation programs, our farm programs, can we encourage and create incentives for better behavior? You know, climate and ecosystem services markets. This current administration has quietly done some important technical work on how we would measure and track soil carbon, which can be the foundation for being able to participate in both national and international carbon markets, be they voluntary or compliance-based. And that kind of work can continue. And I think you'll see more and stronger emphasis on it, not just at USDA, but within some interagency oomph behind it as well. And on research, you know, I think Dan very correctly said as well that research is really sort of the backbone and the jewel of USDA. And I will say that when I was at USDA in the Obama administration and would meet with my foreign counterparts, they would always say how jealous they were of our research and extension and how much, you know, they used it. You know, speaking at a conference in Colombia, to have their coffee traders say that they rely on our, you know, reports on coffee production, consumption, et cetera, as the way that they forecast in Colombia. You know, our research is really, and forecasting is really unparalleled. And so really returning that to the position that it needs in the department, addressing concerns about loss of staff and morale, that's going to be an important early on decision for a new secretary. Of course, others have mentioned the importance of SNAP, addressing food hunger and nutrition. I would say that as well. I think there's also a real opportunity to think about USDA's role in the overall government in terms of our international presence. You know, Secretary Veneman, Secretary Glickman, Espy, all of you mentioned our international organizations and how important the FAO, the World Food Program, WHO, how important they are in terms of addressing the spread of disease, opening markets, creating international standards and certainty. We will need to show up and show leadership in organizations like those and the WTO again, and USDA needs to be at that table. So international presence and influence. And then I think there a real possibility for bipartisan work in a new administration could be around infrastructure and the potential of working with Congress on an infrastructure bill as well. And of course, making sure that there is a focus on our rural infrastructure in any bill going forward could be an important out of the gates consideration and area of focus for a new Secretary of Agriculture. So again, many of the points have been covered by my colleagues here, so I will turn it back to you to get into the discussion.
All right, thank you so much, Darcy. Really appreciate the insights. And as we get started here, I want to set the stage, and we're going to get to a whole host of things. And I know we're starting to get some questions populate, several of them from the environmental front and how that integrates into this whole conversation around conservation agriculture and what can be done. But let me set the stage here before we begin. The next Secretary of Agriculture will be walking into the job at the height of a pandemic. 2020 net farm income forecast to rise to $119 billion, nearly 40% of that income coming from government payments. New estimates, up to 50 million Americans may face food insecurity this next year. Supply chains have been stressed. Restaurants are closing. More people are now eating at home. A recent Gallup poll showed that Americans, for the first time in 20 years of taking this tracking poll, showed that their view of various businesses and industries puts agriculture number one, the most positive perception among all industries and businesses, including the federal government, as the most positive outlook. So where does a new leader begin? And I think that conversation has to start with the current pandemic. And I might start with you, Secretary Espy, on your thoughts as stepping into that role, coming in, and where should we start to begin that job of a new Secretary of Agriculture, and what should be done?
Well, I mean, this was mentioned by all of us. COVID pandemic is the #1 health issue in the world today. This is V-Day in Great Britain. This is the first day that any human being has been vaccinated, and that's happening today in Great Britain. So, I mean, there's a green light ahead. There's good news on the horizon for United States and for U.S. agriculture. So, as I said before, and as most of us mentioned, I think if you're a Secretary of Agriculture, you want to make sure that the American people have confidence in the food supply. And that begins with those who process the food. So I would go directly into the federally regulated poultry plants, hog plants, beef processing plants, wherever there's a federal license that you have authority to do something. And I mean, you have a heavy hand of government because it's called debarment. So if any government or any company is reticent to follow the USDA guidelines, which I think will follow the CDC guidelines, I think that they're going to be sorry about doing that. So I just make sure that the medical professionals that will inform the Biden administration make sure that agriculture is involved, and the Secretary of Agriculture is involved in that, to make sure that all the federally insured plants, particularly the workers, are safe, secure, they have the PPE. I would make sure that after those in the nursing homes and those medical professionals are inoculated, I would really make sure that as essential workers, the food process workers are maybe moved up the line to be inoculated, maybe third or fourth.
Secretary Glickman, do you think our processors, our workers in our food manufacturing facilities fit the need to keep the supply chains running? I think I've got you on mute still.
Do this every time. I think they've gotten better. I think some weren't prepared very well. I think some maybe didn't take into account the health needs of workers as much as they realize that they have to do. And I think that, but I see some good evidence out there that everybody's getting with the act right now. But we've seen how COVID affects the whole supply chain. But if I were secretary now, I guess nobody's asked me, so I'm probably not in the queue. But if I were secretary, what I would do, first of all, is make sure that USDA has an assertive, positive role in the government of the United States in terms of COVID response. that it not just be viewed as kind of a secondary role, because the health of animals, the health of plants, and the health of humans all relate to each other. So I would want to make sure that I would tell the president, I want to be included in all these discussions about how we're going to deal with COVID, both from an operational perspective and again, from a research perspective. I go back to this research angle, is that this is a disease that more than likely most scientists said jumped from an animal to a human. So did Ebola, so did SARS, and so do most of the other diseases that we're seeing out there in the world right now. So the second thing I would do is to sit down with the research establishment at USDA and around the country at land grant schools and non-land grant schools. And I said, what are we going to do to protect ourselves from the next pandemic that could wipe out a big number of human beings and could destroy agriculture in the process? Those would probably, as we start, I mean, there's so many things you do as Secretary of Agriculture, as Ann Veneman talked about, the Forest Service and nutrition. And the final thing I would say is this: there shouldn't be a war between the food, nutrition, and production agriculture sectors of the Department of Agriculture. Frankly, if I had my way, I would change the name of USDA to the Department of Agriculture, Nutrition, and Forestry, which is the name that the Senate Agriculture Committee uses, because that provides the functions of what we're talking about. And we've got to make sure that nutrition, production agriculture, forestry, and research all work together in a holistic way and try to make this pandemic as less difficult as possible and prevent future pandemics. Thank you.
Secretary Veneman, I know if we look at some of the statistics, total grocery store and food service retail sales are running about $4 billion behind previous year levels. We could lose up to 100,000 restaurants in this country, and half of grocery stores could close in some of our rural areas. How do we go about making sure that those critical supply points and cogs in our food system don't go away? And does the USDA have a role in that? I think you're on mute. Perfect.
There.
Gotcha.
Sorry about that. I think certainly USDA has a role in looking at how the food system is operating. I frankly, given the difficulties in the food system initially, with, as I said in my opening, with 50% of the food being sold through out of home, whether it's restaurants or the cruise ships or the Disneylands of the world. I mean, all of the sporting events, all of those were closed down. So you had 50% of the food that wasn't going through its normal food chain, and most of that food was going through a separate food chain, often with separate contracts to the farmers. And so I think it's important for USDA to help the industry pivot in these kinds of situations. I think we've learned a lot from this. I've frankly been impressed with how quickly the food system has pivoted to really address the needs of the grocery sector, because so many more people are eating meals at home. As I said, there is an acceleration. One speaker I heard said that we are with online ordering where they thought they would be 5 years from now. It accelerated that quickly. And so we have a new consumer behavior that I think is important for the USDA to understand as well. So you have an increase in the number of restaurants that are going to basically like a ghost kitchen, because it's all about delivery now. They don't need the restaurant facility as much. And so you're seeing real changes in how food is consumed, where it's consumed, and how it's consumed. And it's important for USDA to understand those trends as we look at the food system and go forward.
Why don't we turn it over now to Darcy Vetter, former Chief Agriculture Negotiator there at USTR. And Darcy, as we talk about COVID-19 and we look at global trade, we did see impacts early on. We've started to see some of our agricultural trade catch back up to where we're about equal with where we were last year. Do we expect a long-term impact to agricultural trade because of COVID-19?
I think for the most part, the trade system worked well. And frankly, some of the investments that we made in that system, particularly the sharing of market information, was particularly helpful in dealing with the COVID pandemic, particularly lessons we learned from the 2008 price spikes. And that is in part, you saw transportation routes shut down. Countries were a little bit worried about being able to procure supply. Shortages that you saw on grocery store shelves created concerns. Was there actually a global shortage, or was that the result of more localized supply chains, breaking down, or transportation routes? And I think the global system, the AMIS system that was set up in 2008, the Agricultural Market Information System, quickly mobilized to say, actually, our global stocks are fine. What we need to do is focus on reconnecting the dots to get the food where it needs to be. And so countries that may have moved early to restrict exports, or might have gone toward hoarding or panic buying, worried about supplies, I think having that system in place, of the countries that did act to restrict exports, most of them reduced those restrictions pretty quickly or didn't enforce them. And we saw, continued movement, better sharing of information. And I think, again, comments at the beginning about the importance of participating and really focusing on international institutions, that's a case in point of where those things tend to work. So you have seen trade pick back up. I think you've seen some of the transportation networks knit themselves back together, or people have found workarounds as trade has come back online. I think, and so generally, I think we are in an okay place in terms of movement post-COVID. Where I would watch are, were some of the disruptions in agricultural inputs, were changes in, investment in processing, where those maybe have changed, where businesses may not have survived or had to change their model due to COVID. What does that mean 6 months from now when we have planting or harvest? Have we disrupted the business model or the ability of some farmers, not just in the US, but in other countries as well, to sort of change their decision? And what will the impact of that be?
We anticipate a long tail on this entire issue. Going back to Secretary Espy, a new administration coming into USDA, taking a look at programs. Do you expect a focus of the USDA to shift toward food or nutrition versus maybe a farm and agricultural focus, or do you expect it to be more of a balanced approach? Your thoughts?
Well, it's all of it. Frankly, it's all of it. It's a very large department. The 2 years that I was privileged to serve as secretary, I think our annual budget was $68 billion, and now it's about $150 billion. So all these functions are very important, and I guess the production function still leads the rest, but it's closely followed on by nutrition and rural development and the rest of them. So you can't sacrifice one to the good of the others. The secretary, whoever he or she might be, has to balance all of the equities and all of the variation in all of it. The bottom line is that United States continues as the #1 most proficient, most technologically able producer of food and fiber in the world. So it's a function of the USDA to make sure that it can enact policies to stabilize and lift income and yields, and make sure that our presence across the globe is robust and not insular. So that's why we have to focus on trade, because 2/3 of the income that these farmers will receive must come from global markets. So we can't retreat or recede from all these multilateral new markets. That's why I am so concerned about China, what happened with the United States leaving our #1 market for soybeans and other crops through a policy that was executed with blunt force and not precision. So now that markets are coming back, but it's coming back in many ways because our competition is weaker. I think now that we need to move into China to make sure that we can fill the vacuum what China is expanding. And that means, to me, considering going into the TPP, making sure that we have a more robust presence with the World Trade Organization and all of these multilateral groups that we discussed. Also, again, I'm going to say Cuba. Cuba is 90 miles away. And under the Obama policy, we began to restore tourism to Cuba. There was liberalization in the agricultural trade to Cuba, but we never got to the point we would give Cuba agricultural credit, which is really what they need. So I think we need to look at the Helms-Burton Act to give Cuba the ability for agricultural credit, and then they will buy our rice, our beans, our corn, and that's what we need to do. So USDA is a huge agency. It's got myriad of functions, and I don't think that you should sacrifice one over the other, except that the production function will continue to be #1. All of the income, price, and yield programs, all of the insurance programs, I believe will continue. But we have to make sure we have rural development, broadband, nutrition, all of the things that we discussed are close second and third.
Secretary, I'll jump back to our other panelists here in just a moment, but I want to stay with you because I know you have another appointment that you're looking to get to and may have to leave us early. You mentioned equity issues in agriculture and through USDA. Tell us what you think those may be and what are some things that we should be focusing on specifically.
Yes, the agriculture industry is very broad. We've got a lot of large producers, but because of the increase in cost of inputs, cost of technology, many of these producers now have to consolidate and join one with another to produce food efficiently. But you have a lot of smaller farmers that are not able to make that bar, and they should not be forgotten. So we have a lot of smaller farmers, minority farmers, women farmers, younger farmers that must be considered, that must be in the game. USDA has to look out for them. And that means give them access to technology, access to training, access to credit. Dan Glickman well understands, as I did, about a lawsuit against the USDA on behalf of minority farmers, which was successful. And we don't need to go there again. So we know what to do. What I'm saying is that everyone must be included, no matter your race, no matter your gender, no matter your age, because we're the best in the world and we want to continue that, and everybody must be made a part of it.
Secretary Glickman, Veneman, do either of you have any thoughts, comments, follow-ups with what Secretary Espy is talking about? Secretary Glickman, I think you're on mute.
I did it again. It shows you, boy, I'm not a good technological secretary for our current times, that's for sure. But I would say, I agree with Mike, and the issue of discrimination against minority farmers was a huge issue. The case of Pigford versus Glickman, my name remains on the case, which Mike and I and Ann and Tom Vilsack all worked to solve, was really high priority because we really need a diversity of farmers out there. I want to mention one other thing. That's a word we haven't talked about before, Congress. Congress is critical in agriculture policy. In fact, many people believe that the Agriculture Department is really the congressionally run and owned department as compared to other departments in government, particularly the United States Senate. Many of them, as the two secretaries, and I'm sure Darcy understood when she was there, felt that the USDA was their own. And they, you know, and so I think that's one of the reasons why Mike is right. USDA tends to focus on production agriculture because the Congress wants it to focus on production agriculture. And primarily in the United States Senate, where every senator has farm country in their states. Not every House member, only about 20% of House seats are have much agriculture whatsoever. So it's really important that as the new USDA comes in, he or she has to recognize that Congress is a real equal partner when it comes to all of the issues that we've talked about today. And it's delicate and tricky because we've seen it used to be a lot more bipartisan. When Ann and I and Mike were there as secretaries, nutrition folks, hunger folks, and farm folks worked together more than I think they do now. There was less partisanship back in the old days. I hate to keep saying that the world of the past was better because it's not always true. But when it came to dealing with hunger and nutrition, those coalitions that were formed with Bob Dole and George McGovern and Jim McGovern and you know, both sides of the aisle worked together to help farmers, but also to help hungry people. And those bipartisan coalitions in the last few years have been kind of missing from these debates. And when they're missing, you can't solve the kind of problems we need to do to help farmers and ranchers cope, to help hungry people eat, to do the research to fight disease and the other things that USDA does. So I really do think that I keep saying the number one job, there are 19 number one jobs of the new secretary, but one of the number one jobs is to sit down with Congress and try to work out a relationship and agenda where we can work on these issues holistically. They help farmers cope, but help hungry people eat, and making sure that the other food safety and the equity issues that Mike talked about are also dealt with. So I just thought I needed to reinforce this role of Congress as we talk about the other issues.
Absolutely, thank you so much.
Clinton?
Yeah, go ahead.
Could I just, I've got to start off now. As you know, I'm chairing another meeting that starts in about 8 minutes. So I want to thank the Farm Foundation. I want to thank Sherry for my inclusion. I want to thank Ann and Dan for participating in this. And it's good to see both of you again. I want to mention one thing and then I'm gone. I'm in Mississippi and I want to mention a word that no one has uttered, and the word is marijuana. In a recent election we just had here in Mississippi, there was a medical marijuana referendum on the ballot, and it passed by 65%. In red, rural, conservative Mississippi, the voters said, we want medical marijuana because, you know, we see the benefits of it. So when I was a member of Congress, when I was Secretary of Agriculture, the USDA focused on the, you know, the primary crops, you know, corn, wheat, dairy, rice, so forth. But since then, we have an expansion. And when you talk about diversity, it's not just in the producers, it's in the eligible crops. Now we have a lot of specialty crops that are eligible now for price supports, yield supports, income supports, fruits and vegetables. And I know this is not going to happen at the federal level in the next about 4 years probably, but in the not too distant future, I think that those producers of marijuana as an income crop will demand a seat at the table because it's a high profit crop. It's now available in maybe a majority of the states in America, if not recreationally, but medically. And I think that is coming. So all of these are things that Secretary of Agriculture must take into consideration. So it passed Mississippi, it's going to pass everywhere. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. We really appreciate you taking the time to be with us today. We know you're very busy, and everyone on the panel really appreciate your insights today, Secretary Espy. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, guys. Bye-bye.
All right, bye. And one of the things that Mike talked a little bit about is the idea of diversity. And Secretary Veneman, I want to go to you and talk about the idea of climate and in conservation and environment, and where all those things may meet together over the next 4 years in agricultural policy. What's your outlook there?
Let me first echo just what my colleagues have said. First of all, what Dan Glickman said about Congress, I think, is extremely important. And I think one other thing to add into that equation is that both the longstanding chair and ranking committee of the House, both are gone from Congress now. New people are taking over. Likewise, Senator Pat Roberts left in the Senate as chair of the Senate Ag Committee. So Senator Debbie Stabenow is really the only one who will be continuing. So I think that congressional relationship is going to be even more important because of that change of leadership. In addition, I would say that, and this is relevant to the climate issues as well, is that in addition to working with the Congress, it's important to really work with the White House and help them understand the tremendous breadth of this Department of Agriculture, because often they don't. I will never forget walking into a meeting, one of the policy cabinet level meetings one time with President Bush, and he said, "And what does the USDA have to do with this issue?" And, it was just an eye-opener for so many that didn't understand the department, who were in the White House and in other departments, to learn about the breadth and depth of this department, which I think then relates to the climate issue, because one of the things that the president-elect has focused on is how jobs, the environment, agriculture, all really link together, that we have to have climate smart economic policies that will then lead to jobs and more sustainable industries, including agriculture. I think we've got to look very carefully at things like soil health, which is becoming higher and higher on the agenda of people who really understand these climate issues now. How do we integrate those kinds of practices into the programs that we implement in the Farm Bill through NRCS and so forth? So I think there's going to be a lot more focus in how all of these issues can integrate together. And I think that there are technologies that are now being developed that can also accelerate climate smart agriculture practices. I mean, agriculture has taken a big hit because people say there's tremendous, greenhouse gases that come from agriculture. But agriculture can also be a big part of the solution if farmers are given the opportunities to really produce in climate smart ways. And we know it can be done. We know we can help with the environment with agriculture. And so I think that we have to have a seat at the table, and we have to really help farmers get from here to there and really help. The other thing that we see is on the technology side, there is a lot of focus now on alternative protein. And so we see alternatives for milk, dairy protein. We see alternatives for meat protein, the huge advances in consumer acceptance of plant-based meat alternatives. The first cell-based product just went on the market this week in Singapore, not here in the US, but Singapore. And that whole area is going to increase. Obviously, USDA has a big role in regulating that, but many of those technologies are being sold on the point that it's good for the environment. That's how they're often being sold to the consumer. And I think we have to be aware of how quickly these technologies are coming into the marketplace and what is the role of USDA in regulating some of them.
Darcy Vetter, as we talk about climate and agriculture, and we start to look at some of the broader picture, where do you think this fits as far as the future of the department and policy agenda over the next 4 years?
I think it's right at the heart of it. I mean, I think that Regenerative agriculture and regenerative practices have the potential to create new income streams and be a stabilizing factor at a time when commodity prices have been more volatile, and where I think trade tensions and other relationships may, some of those things may persist. And certainly the impact of climate itself may create volatility in terms of yield for products. Can we create consistency in terms of payments for how those products are produced? I think that in order to do that and do it well, that climate will have to be at the center of our research programs. Again, measuring, tracing, making sure that there's permanence to efforts that we are taking on to put carbon back in the soil. And I think it has to be a key part of our international outreach and our foreign ag service work in helping other countries and technical assistance understand what carbon reserves they have in soil, how they can use their own agricultural practices to be climate smart and add to the climate problem. Work with our partners in Europe, for example, that are putting in place policies right now on their farm to fork strategy as part of the European New Deal, and making clear that they want to use climate tools. Are they going to measure soil carbon in the same way we do? Are they going to recognize the way we measure it? Are we going to be able to create international consistency and interoperability between trading schemes that may exist for carbon, so that as multinational companies look at either meeting voluntary commitments or complying with climate mandates in one country or another, they can use relationships with US farmers to help them get there and compensate farmers for that work. So again, I think it has to be at the heart of a number of things we do. And let's not forget, Ann Veneman mentioned already the importance of forestry here, but also our rural development tools, the rural utilities service. How are we looking at efficiency when we look at rural housing? How are we also taking into account additional risks from climate, but opportunities to reduce energy use as well? As I said in my opening remarks, I think a big lens for climate has to be climate, and each of those programs we have at USDA, can we use the authorities that are there in this very broad department to think about how we can create synergies with the climate agenda?
Secretary Glickman, do you think this is we are starting to see some private businesses, private industry get into the carbon market kind of area? Is this a public-private partnership? Is it public? Is it private? Or maybe does USDA have a role in certification here?
Well, USDA has a big role because it provides a lot of the seed money in the rural development area, in terms of business and industry loans or rural utility services. But a lot of this is public-private partnerships. I mean, you're seeing more and more companies becoming engaged in the climate area, either through satellite techniques or carbon sequestration techniques. I happen to be on the board of the Chicago Mercantile Exchange, and we're looking at the whole issue of the futures markets and how it might relate to helping farmers do risk management practices. The USDA's risk management tools are just monumental and monumentally important, but they can't be done alone. They'd have to be done holistically with the private sector and other areas of government as well. And I do want to mention one other thing, which I think Darcy talked about and Ann did as well. This whole issue of rural broadband, everybody talks about, but nothing seems to happen. We make such incremental progress in it. And you look at COVID today, where about 30% of the population has no or virtually no rural broadband. By the way, there are big areas of urban America that don't have broadband, but it impacts rural America much more. In the 1950s, President Eisenhower and Congress decided to build an interstate highway system to every part of the country, and they did it. And it was paid for, and there were metrics, and it was done. And for the life of me, I can't understand why our government, working with the private sector, doesn't say within 5 years, we're going to do, or 10 years, whatever the appropriate time is, but I'd say shorter rather than longer, we're going to connect everybody to the internet, period. We're going to pay for it. It's going to get done. It's the best thing we can do for rural development. If people want to have access to the internet, they're economically at a huge disadvantage to the rest of the world. And so we need to just do more than say we need more rural broadband. We need to do it. And USDA is a big factor in getting that done, but it can't be done without the private sector as well. It's going to cost a lot of money, but you know what? It'll save big parts of rural America from going further and further into despair.
I remember President Clinton giving a speech on rural broadband when he was in office, and here we are, however many years later, still working on the issue. And with so many kids doing virtual school right now, given the stress of the pandemic, it's been a real concern even for my family, and I know countless others around the country. So it will be something that hopefully we can make real progress on, but it seems to get a lot of attention, but not a lot of real progress.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, there is some progress being made, but underserved parts of the country, tribal communities, and poorer parts of the country just don't have access to it. And as you say, it's critical to survive today. It's not a luxury anymore.
Secretary Veneman, as we start to talk about some of the other issues, and we're getting close to the point where we need to move on and start taking some questions because we don't want to linger too long. We're about an hour in already, which is going incredibly fast. But I want to get to a few other topics before we move on too far. As we talk about trade, do you expect the next 4 years in ag policy to be status quo, or will it be a major focus like it's been the last 4 years, or will it be renewed back to kind of a more of an incremental pursuit?
Well, I think there's been a lot of kind of disruption of trade and trade agreements with this administration. I mean, there are the issues with China, as have been already pointed out, and Darcy's, of course, much better equipped to talk about some of these than I, but I think you know, we had a disruption with the renegotiation of NAFTA. We didn't enter the Trans-Pacific Partnership. We pulled out of that, which I think was a mistake. I don't know whether it's too late to re-enter, but I think these are the things that the administration is going to have to really consider. It's going to have to review. You know, the USTR, we don't know who's going to lead that. And I think there's going to have to be a real look at how do we promote good trade policies of the future. I mean, the farmers would prefer to get their income out of the market rather than, as you say, so much coming from the government. And a lot of that's been done because of the disruption of the China market. And I think, you know, I think there has to be a review of the trade and trade policies and how they're affecting agriculture. So I really think that's a huge issue that is going to have to be addressed as this new administration comes in. Where are we and how do we go forward from here? It doesn't look like we've made any progress at all on WTO negotiations. The world has made much more progress in regional and bilateral trade agreements. And I think there really needs to be review of how that goes forward as well.
Darcy Vetter, I know obviously you've been intimately involved in a lot of trade negotiations and work on the trade front from an agricultural perspective. Your thoughts on the next 4 years, what should we expect to see from this administration from a farm and agricultural food perspective?
Well, I think what we see from a farm and agricultural and food perspective may depend somewhat on the larger conversation about trade itself. You know, we're coming from an administration that really ran to the left of the Democratic Party in terms of their message about trade. And so trade politics have sort of been put on their heads. And the focus has really been on import sensitive sectors of the US economy and what can be done to protect them from unfair trade practices and from competitiveness issues outside of the US. And those are absolutely important issues. But we've sort of lost our focus on further opening markets for those sectors of the economy, including agriculture, that are export competitive. And so I think we have to find that balance between saying, you know, how can we look at some of the key manufacturing sectors? How do we look at equipping our population to be competitive in a new global economy? How can we work with our allies to address China's unfair trading practices and not try to take this on as a purely bilateral issue, while at the same time making a list of those things that we need to do to remain competitive for our export dependent sectors. And, you know, the Biden administration has said it may not look to radically change our agreements with China in the near term. It wants to really analyze that first. May not look to launch new trade deals immediately. But frankly, launching a trade deal is a big thing with Congress and the notification that has to happen, the analysis that has to happen. I think there's a lot that USDA and frankly stakeholder groups can do to say, over the past 4 years, with the EU doing new deals, with TPP going forward without us, with RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, the ASEAN countries and China coming together just these couple of weeks ago, what does our competitive position look like in these really dynamic areas of the world, Southeast Asia in particular? Which countries do we need to be looking at establishing more preferential relationships with? What is the footprint in Asia that will bring us back to more competitive footing? And I think there's a lot of groundwork we can do in the near term to think about how we prioritize and structure those relationships. And as many of the folks listening in know, there is always a technical barrier to trade, an SPS issue, certification, licensing. A lot of the trade work that can be done is just that bilateral kind of knocking down one barrier after another. And I think a really aggressive approach to make sure that the relationships we have are working as well as they can be is also a priority coming in right out of the gate.
Are you surprised, or did you expect that a Biden administration would be take time to study the phase 1 deal, not take off tariffs right away, to be a little more, from what we've had reported and what folks are saying, not rush in to change anything right away? Are you surprised by that, or did you expect that?
I'm not surprised by that because I think these things take time. And I think that the current administration chose to set up a relationship that was based on tariffs. And so until you have established a dialogue and a structure to replace that with, when we know that China has not addressed the underlying problems that started that relationship to begin with, I would not have chosen tariffs as a primary tool to begin that conversation and that pressure with China. But I think we do have to move that conversation into a better space. I do think there are some decisions that will be, big ones for this administration, and that is, while there are tariffs in place on the vast majority of things that we import from China, there are also a number of exemptions from those tariffs that have been granted, but that expire on December 31. And, will those exemptions be continued in a new administration? How will those things be dealt with? So there are a lot of technical issues that the administration will have to make some tough choices about. But I think you've seen, even just in the past week or so, some pretty strong and positive overtures from our European colleagues, for example, to say, hey, incoming administration, let's work together on trade and let's think about those areas where we have some things in common, one of them being curbing China's behavior, which may have an impact then on steel and aluminum tariffs that are applied to Europe, may have an impact on how we structure discussions with China going forward, again, broadening the table on our side to bring joint pressure, not just taking action in a bilateral fashion. But relations are can sometimes be time consuming. They're not always, they don't always happen on January 20th at noon. So, look for that to be a process.
Absolutely. Secretary Glickman, one of the things that we discussed in preparing for today's forum was the role of the forestry in USDA and how that may look different. Talk to us about your thoughts from a forestry perspective over the next 4 years and what a new administration may try to pursue.
Well, you're talking to a guy who comes from a state that's not known for the number of trees that it has.
Yeah, that's right.
We love our trees. We just don't have very many of them. Again, Ann would be in a better position than I, but number one, the Forest Service is the largest part of USDA in terms of employees. I think, Ann, we're close to 39,000 employees. To give you some idea, all the farm programs have about 1/3 of that, or maybe 1/4. And when you count conservation, it may be up to maybe 40% of that. So number two is that the recent administration basically had a philosophy of a lot more use of the forest for industrial use, timber cutting, related issues. I suspect that this new administration will be more conservation minded. For example, the new administration has, the Trump administration proposed to getting rid of what was called the roadless rule in Alaska, which prohibited a lot of timber cutting in the Tongass Forest in Alaska. I suspect that you're going to see a lot more preservation of forest lands, which of course may cause some economic conflict, particularly in the West, the Pacific Northwest. But this issue of forest fires, which Ann raised, is so critically important because we're seeing a doubling, tripling, quadrupling of number of fires taking place now than took place 20 or 30 years ago. And it's no doubt related to changing weather patterns and climate. And this is going to have a high priority for the new secretary, who's going to have to spend more time on forestry issues, I think, than perhaps what he or she might have thought of, because generally speaking, the Secretary of Agriculture is not chosen because of his or her expertise in forestry issues. It's usually in traditional farm commodity issues of one sort or the other. But it is really important that we address these issues.
Secretary Veneman, I may let you jump in here and comment real quick, given your home state and giving us a little bit of perspective here before we pivot to start to take some questions here from our audience.
Yeah, I think clearly the Forest Service is, as Secretary Glickman said, it's the largest part of USDA in terms of number of employees. And of course, the nutrition programs are the largest in terms of budget. But I think that there are several things that have contributed to the increase in forest fires. One is just the amount of pine beetle damage that even when I was secretary had begun to make its way west. So I saw it in Utah and Colorado when I was secretary, but it has really come to California. Now, there has not been enough money allocated to really do good forest cleaning and forest management. And so we end up spending it all in emergency on the other end because of the fires. And I think it's critical that we begin to look at really comprehensive forest management, how it can be done most effectively. Sometimes that means controlled burns, as the Native Americans used to use, and we've used before in the Forest Service. But keep in mind, the USDA has the Forest Service because that's where President Theodore Roosevelt put it, because it was to be a multiple use public land policy around forestry. And so I think that the Forest Service has done an excellent job over the years of doing that, but they do need a lot more support in terms of good forest management and have the resources to be able to do that.
Thank you very much. I'm sure we'll have more questions and more conversations about that. I'd like to bring in now Bill Flory. He operates a 4th generation Idaho grain farm. He is a Farm Foundation Roundtable Fellow and currently serves as chairperson of the Wheat Marketing Center, as well as commissioner of the Iowa Wheat Commission. I'd like to invite Bill to provide some reaction, ask some questions of our panelists here, and just overall give us a response from a farmer perspective in today's conversation. Bill, I think you're on mute.
Now I am.
Gotcha.
Great panel, and to the former secretaries and Darcy, very, very pertinent. Just a quick update on the conversation about trade and the Northwest. Portland is busy through March and will probably be at a record volume. The big surprise is not corn, it's not beans or wheat. It's corn. Exports are excellent, and they're booked clear through March. So weather's good, loadings are good. They've got the COVID criteria on incoming vessels worked out, and it's great for the balance of trade, and it's great for production agriculture. Talking about forestry and Idaho as the 4th I state is really got a lot of timber. Management of this timber, I couldn't echo that sentiment anymore. Management of the timber is very essential, no matter what what the weather is, we have to think long-term and manage that timber. Question I had, and a number of the panelists have brought it up, and that is the stature and the presence that a secretary has in an administration. Some would call it, interagency status. Can they get the ag industry and related industries ideas on the administration's docket and see them through? And Secretary Glickman did an excellent job on this in regard to export enhancement and European issues. And I just wonder how the panel views this administration's ability to have great interagency influence, for the short and long term for production agriculture.
Well, since you mentioned my name, I'll start. First of all, Bill, you look great. It's been a long time, used to help me on issues, and I still remember that. I just have to tell a quick anecdote. So during a cabinet meeting during the Clinton administration, Andrew Cuomo sat next to me. Of course, he's the distinguished governor of New York now, but he was the housing and urban development, and I was the agriculture. And we had this long discussion about trade, Darcy, but Andrew and I were kind of laughing at each other, and President Clinton saw that, and it was almost like the principal telling the kids to stop talking to each other. He said, what are you talking about? And Cuomo said, well, Glickman and I were talking, and we were saying that Glickman represents rural and I represent urban. We don't need the rest of you at this cabinet table. We have the whole government right here. Well, that's not really true, but I think it was a little bit metaphorical in the sense that the importance of the Secretary of Agriculture being able to engage at the highest levels, at the interagency task force, and to deal with a lot of these issues, and not in a stovepiped way, but in a more comprehensive, holistic way, because the problems are in fact holistic. Now, I was lucky. I served with a president that was kind of the proverbial good old boy. And he came from a small state, and he knew agriculture better than I did. And as a matter of fact, when I was being considered to be secretary, I met with him and Leon Panetta, who was his chief of staff. And so we started talking, and he said, well, do you want to be my secretary? And I said, oh, I'd love to be secretary. And then I said, what do you want me to do in this job? Because I wanted to get a charge from him, like, okay, go out and take care of farmers, go out and do this. And he said, well, just remember this. The only two people that matter here on these issues is you and me. And just remember that you always have access to me if you need it. And it was kind of like, it's tough because the president has so many things on his or her mind all the time, just thousands of issues. And how you keep food and agriculture issues, whether it's food safety, whether it's farmer health, whether it's research, whether it's trade, how you keep that on the agenda. And it just means you have to be persistent and tough. And Tom Vilsack did a great job of this. He had a close relationship with President Obama. Obama did not come from farm country like President Clinton did, but Vilsack had the access in there and the tenacity, and that's really what it takes. It takes leadership at the department level, and it requires a secretary to listen to folks like you to make sure that the messages are being conveyed. So that would be my best answer.
Sure. Any other thoughts from Ann Veneman?
Yeah, I think, well, first of all, I completely agree with what Secretary Glickman has said, is that, you really have to make sure that they understand the breadth of what issues you're involved with the department. So you talk about a relationship with Cuomo when you were Secretary of Agriculture. I also had a relationship with the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development because we were doing some rural housing programs, and the programs that we had some overlap. And I think there has to be outreach also to your other cabinet colleagues so that they understand where there is overlap. One of the reasons I think there is a great opportunity in this incoming administration is because of the focus that this administration is putting on the climate and environment issues. And USDA has a huge role to play through the climate-friendly ag practices, through better Forest Service practices, through the way most of the programs can be run in an environmentally friendly way. The food waste issues we haven't talked about. There's a big role for USDA to play in that, but there's a role for other departments to play as well. And I think that as we look toward the future, USDA should have a center seat at the table with this environment focused, related to jobs and the economy message that this president-elect has been talking about.
If I might, Bill, I think that if you spend any time reading the Biden campaign's plans for Build Back Better, I think you'll see that, you know, when it comes to infrastructure, it talks specifically about rural issues. When it talks about climate, it talks specifically about the contributions from agriculture. When you look at issues of social justice and equity, you know, it really looks across populations in all parts of the country. And so I think that the approach so far has been a holistic approach on climate and how do we address it across all areas of the economy, a holistic approach on hunger. And so USDA will have to be at the table if they're going to actually, you know, discuss those issues in the way that they've been framed up thus far. And, you know, I think there's a real opportunity there to showcase the breadth of the department and to show how, you know, what is the role of USDA in infrastructure? What is the role of USDA in climate? You know, what is the role of USDA in making sure that we're providing the best possible service and opportunity for people, you know, regardless of their income, their race, their gender, et cetera. And so I actually was encouraged by the way that this incoming administration has chosen to outline those issues that makes it clear that they're not just urban or just rural issues or just for people of, you know, one income, et cetera. They really, I think, laid out their plans in a way that invites that participation.
Bill, thank you so much for jumping on here and getting us started with audience questions. I think right now we'll pivot to see if we can answer a few more of our audience questions. We have a whole number of them here, about 35, 37 questions. We don't have that much time. So I'll ask my panel members if they will to keep responses and answers short, and we'll see if we can kind of rapid fire through a number of these questions and start to get some of those answered, because there are some great ones here. And I'm going to begin with one that was submitted before we began from Len Bull. He asked, will the expected growth of non-meat meat change policy on ag exports or farmland use? And Darcy, I might start with you as far as an ag export, this whole new protein wave that we're seeing.
I'm not sure why it would change our policy on agricultural exports. I think that, you know, the overall policy, when you look at the US, has been to take a risk-based approach and to ask other countries to judge our products based on their safety and their quality and, you know, their value, what they bring to the table. And if we reach the point where we are producing new products, whether that's cell-cultured meat or more plant-based product, and want to export it, then we would be asking, you know, other countries to judge it on its merits. You know, it certainly might change the flow of product. Are we exporting less animal protein and more plant protein in different forms? It might change the structure of our exports over time. That's certainly a possibility. I'm not sure it would change our approach to trade, which is really to look at, you know, where we have the best opportunity and make sure that our products are treated fairly. It may create different markets of interest for us. You know, if you think about plant-based proteins and adding value and variety, are there markets in India where you may have fewer people who eat meat, but that might be interested in you know, a changing diet and what that offers? Certainly, I think the export promotion programs and analysis and work around that USDA does could, you know, change with the attractiveness and the increasing availability of those products. But I don't think it changes our overall approach.
Secretary Veneman, do you think that there's more oversight work to be done on this new and kind of emerging product portfolio?
Well, I think certainly there are going to be some regulatory issues, and I talked a little bit about them before, but I think when we're looking at these products, it's also important to recognize that some of the investors in these new products are actually the meat companies themselves. So I think the meat companies are beginning to look at themselves as protein providers and not just meat companies, and they're getting in on these emerging trends. I think that certainly the USDA, because on the cell-based side, you're actually making meat without raising the animal, but it's still going to be regulated by the Meat and Poultry Inspection Service to some extent in coordination with the FDA. So there is a lot of work going on at the staff level now with some of these companies and with the FDA and the USDA, both in terms of how it will be regulated, how it will be inspected, and how it will be labeled. All of that is in the works now. As I said earlier, some of these products, Impossible Foods, which is a plant-based burger, was first introduced, I think, in Singapore as well. And of course, the Just Company has just introduced the first cell-based poultry product, chicken product, and that also has been in Singapore. So some of these products are being introduced overseas before they're actually on the US markets, and they're testing them there. But I think we're going to continue to see the emergence, particularly of the cell-based. There's also a lot of work being done both in fungi-based products for dairy alternatives and a number of other protein alternatives as we look toward the future. And I think we're going to see a lot more movement in these spaces as we go forward.
All right. Well, we'll begin kind of our rapid fire. Oh, go ahead.
I was going to say, I think in terms of like a trade policy approach, that may not change. But I think to a point Ann made now and made earlier on sustainability requirements that may go with foods and, marketing according to that environmental footprint. I think that's something really to watch in this space. And, will there be, border taxes or other labeling requirements that create either opportunities or barriers there with particular meat or meat alternatives, for example. And so I think those may come from the private sector before they come actually as governmental mandates. But I think that's an area to watch in terms of trade strategies as well attached to some of those products.
And Clinton, if I just may add.
Yeah, go ahead.
I know you got a lot of things, but just quickly, I think there's great promise for indoor agriculture, particularly as we eat more fruits and vegetables, because the medical community is going to tell us that we need to do that. And indoor agriculture is suitable all over the country. But I do think that the thrust of new technologies, as I look at it, are going to make existing products better. Growing wheat and corn and soybeans and rice with less water, less inputs, and more nutritious. So while some of these products are going to be fine because the consumer ought to have the choices of what they buy, I would hope that our research community takes the lead in investing in those technologies that help farmers grow their crops more efficiently, using less water, less inputs, and perhaps more nutritionally a value for consumers.
Dr. Allison Flynn, DVM with Merck Animal Health, asks, what is the likelihood of a rural broadband being a priority either within a larger infrastructure effort or as a standalone initiative? Secretary Glickman, I know we started there with you. Your thoughts on it being included in something else or as a standalone initiative? And there has been some movement on that front today. In fact, another, several $1 million, $98 million being invested on that front today.
Yeah, I think it needs to be a higher priority. I think it's part of the Biden plan. I've seen broadband being talked about. It just needs to be, there needs to be some metrics with it. You know, there was this architect named Daniel Burnham. He once said, "Make no little plans, for they do not have the power to stir men's souls." And what strikes me is building broadband out to America is a big plan. We can do it if there's the leadership and commitment. It's probably going to be in a broader infrastructure bill. But you look back at rural electrification. How did that happen? Because the New Deal and the Roosevelt administration says, we're going to electrify America. They didn't make any exceptions. I mean, there are a few places that need the help, but they said, this is the way we're going to keep this country, this rural parts of this country, strong. And we need to look at this in the same way.
Secretary Veneman, do you want to jump in on that real quick before we move on?
I don't have much to add to what Secretary Glickman just said, but I agree. I mean, I think the opportunity to be part of a broader infrastructure slash environmentally friendly approach to the economy is broadband has to be a big part of it. And I think there's one of the things that there's been several articles on is because so many people are now working remotely and they're moving to rural areas, they're starting to push in these local, more rural areas to get better connectivity there. And I think that will be potentially helpful to the cause as well.
Great. We got a question from Stephen Kirkava. He's the board of directors with Maison. He asks, do you have thoughts on how to restore the historic bipartisan approach to addressing food insecurity? And Secretary Veneman, maybe we'll start with you on that question.
Well, I'll go back to what Dan Glickman was talking about earlier, is that, you know, these issues traditionally have been bipartisan. People have worked very closely together on them. There have been initiatives on both sides. But, you know, we may need, Dan Glickman's been a strong supporter of hosting another, after 50 years, food and nutrition conference to really look at all of the authorities and how we go forward. I think there's opportunities for bipartisanship. You know, it's been a very difficult time with the way the Congress has operated, and the parties have gotten just more in fight mode as opposed to get it done mode. Although I am encouraged by this problem solvers caucus, this bipartisan group that's come together and is trying to get the COVID relief. You know, if that kind of attitude can permeate other issues like food security and nutrition, I think maybe there's hope. But, you know, it is disappointing to see how so many things have gotten so partisan, and especially those around food and nutrition, because they have been so bipartisan in the past.
Great. This question from Robert Thompson, and he asks, you know, brings up the idea and the question around farm income coming from government payments, and is wondering, please comment on how you see farm policy evolving in the next farm bill or with any tightening of budget or budget constraints. And Secretary Glickman, maybe we go back to you on that question.
You know, it's a very good question. I worry that at some point we're not going to be able to afford these multi-billion-dollar payments. And they're a huge part of farm income and net farm income this year and next year. And they've been there for a lot of reasons, COVID and trade, as Darcy has talked about. And so how are farmers going to cope when, in fact, unless this federal aid goes on forever and ever and ever, which I don't think it will, because I think there will be public and taxpayer resistance to this kind of stuff. So that's why we have to look at finding alternative ways to increase farm income. Trade is one way. Productivity is another way. And again, that comes from a research agenda, which encourages better crops and dealing with climate and that kind of thing. Diversification in agriculture. So farmers and ranchers can grow different kinds of products, and farmers markets, organic agriculture, combined with, of course, traditional production agriculture. But I don't think we're going to be able to afford these massive government payouts. We can't have a system with 30 or 40% of farm income coming from Uncle Sam year after year after year. It sends the wrong signals to the marketplace. It doesn't encourage farmers and ranchers to do the kind of planning that any successful businessman or business person needs to do.
Darcy, one of the questions, I'm kind of combining a couple here, but one of the questions that has come in is around the idea of diversity. And, you know, from a trade perspective, we talk an awful lot about kind of the major commodities and how those get shipped around the world, and they're part of our trade programs. But what about diversity and supporting diversity on farms around the country? Are there opportunities there?
Oh, I think absolutely. Just from a pure trade statistics standpoint, if you look at the volume, the value, and the variety of what is traded internationally in agriculture, that all three of them have gone up substantially. And while bulk commodities may still, you know, movement of soybeans make up a big chunk of those exports every year, value added exports certainly are there. And, you know, diversification of, you know, meeting changing diets and demands, we are well positioned just given the different climate zones, what we grow, our efficiency in growing it, the natural resources we've been blessed with. I think there are huge opportunities to fill demand for a variety of products overseas in greater amounts than we are now. We could definitely diversify our exports. But I do think diversification, going back to what Dan said earlier, if you look at farms of different sizes and how we can look at, and, you know, I think we can be using the research tools of the department to say, on a farm of 500 acres or 5,000 acres, what is the mix of crops that allows you to be most sustainable, most profitable, and is marketing those locally, regionally, globally, the place that can provide the most resilience and the most income opportunity for your farm. And I think, you know, what once was soybeans, you now may have high oleic soybeans, or you may have wheat sold in a specific protein. And so the commodities themselves are sort of becoming decommodified, if that's a word, and really allowing farmers, you know, have more of these market tools to be able to specialize and to think about adding value in some really important ways. And I think the department has an opportunity to say, what does resilience look like in your area of the country at your scale with the markets you can reach? And that goes well beyond, you know, corn and soybeans as your rotation and calling it a day. There's a huge potential for public-private partnership and for diversification of markets sort of at large.
Is that a policy, an information, a incentive type program? What do you think on that?
For me, I think it's a part of a research imperative. It's part of extension and technical assistance. It's, you know, working with farms on pilot projects. It's, you know, embracing and gathering sort of data and experience for some of these disruptive companies that are coming in and creating these sort of spot markets, participation, broader conversation, economic modeling. There are a number of ways the department could participate to try and say, you know, let's make sure farmers have more options and not less.
And I just might add, Clinton, that risk management and crop insurance has become a lot more flexible in recent years. So it used to be, if you grew fresh produce on your wheat base, you could lose your entire wheat base. And I mean, it was punitive. And there were a lot of reasons for this. A lot of times the vegetable and fruit growers didn't want that grown in the wheat part of the country and vice versa. But now the rules have become a lot more flexible, and the planting requirements are more flexible, and risk management tools have become better. Not perfect yet, but much better. And USDA has by and large done a pretty good job in that area.
Do you think we'll see more of that, adding flexibility there?
Well, I hope so. I think farmers want it, need it. I think the land grant schools are trying to encourage that with younger farmers and their students, because now, for example, at a lot of land grants, even in the heartland, they're teaching a lot of horticulture courses. They're doing a lot of things to try to encourage this.
One of the questions we've gotten from several folks, and this is a pretty hot question, but I'm going to go ahead and ask it because it's been mentioned several times. Should or would the next Secretary of Agriculture bring NEFA and ERS back to DC from Kansas City? Secretary Glickman, since you're up, I'll let you answer first.
Well, you just happen to know that I'm from Wichita, which is fairly near Kansas City, but
That's correct.
But look, I don't know everything that went into that decision, but I would say that it was certainly a disruptive decision, and nearly half the people left the government, and so I just don't think it was very good for the long-term future of research. Now, it may have been a good cost-cutting move. I can't answer that question. But I think that the talent pool is what worries me more than anything else. Did we lose this talent pool because of a decision being made for cost reasons? And if so, then there wasn't what I call good strategic thinking being done. We weren't looking down the road and figuring out what do we need for our research establishment over the next decade, rather than how can we save some money by moving all these people out to Kansas City where they might find lower cost rent. Now, again, I don't know all the details. It may be much more complicated than that, but I'm not sure I would have made that decision if I'd been secretary. I don't think so.
Secretary Veneman, I'm gonna let you weigh in here.
I kind of come down right where Dan Glickman is on this. I'm not sure why the decision was made. I mean, I was told at one point that it was because their leases were expiring in the DC area, but I don't think that's a completely compelling reason to. But these agencies have really been gutted of many of their employees. Now, I don't know whether or not you can build them back over the long term. I'm not sure whether a new secretary can come in, for example, and really look at, do we, allow, particularly after COVID, all of a sudden people can work from anywhere. I mean, should you be looking at possibly a restructure of the two organizations now in Kansas City and in DC, and look at whether or not you can have some people that are full or part-time remote working. And so, it's hard sitting on the outside to really know what went into the decision, but I think there are questions that can be asked. The other thing that was done under this last administration is they eliminated the undersecretary for rural development. And I would take another look at that and determine whether or not there are opportunities to restructure, to look at, again, having that undersecretary. I mean, there are also now 3 areas of US, 3 undersecretaries that only have 1 agency. So you basically have the environment, natural resources and environment only has the Forest Service because NRCS moved over with FSA. And so do you need a chief and an undersecretary? Or, same with food safety, you have an administrator of FSIS and you have an undersecretary, but only 1 agency. And then you also have that with food and consumer services. So, should you be, how do you look at the structure of the department? I don't know that I'd spend a lot of time on it, but I think those are all questions that you may want to take a look at.
Absolutely. This question comes from Andrew with Cornell. He's asking about the ability of the president and secretary to work and address some of the critical areas that we've discussed, and how can that get done given the challenges of a split Congress or the ability to get a lot through Congress. As you've all mentioned, the importance of Congress and how the department works and is kind of the people's department here. Secretary Veneman, your thoughts on maybe how we address or how a secretary and a president can address some of these critical things like food security, some of the climate initiatives, some of the other things, COVID-related market disruptions, those types of things.
Well, I think, first of all, it's important just to note that while Congress does have a lot of input into agriculture and ag policy through the Farm Bill and the nutrition authorizations and so forth, there's a lot that can be done in terms of policy, with the department itself, whether or not it's, looking at the regulations right now around nutrition and food stamps, and can we get more people onto the SNAP program right now instead of having them stand in lines. I think that can be done without legislation. we can amend the rules and regulations. So I think there's areas where the department can work with the White House and really look at where can regulatory changes be made to make things more efficient, more effective, more helpful in a time of crisis like we're in now with COVID. Obviously, the Congress is going to have to be involved in new farm bills and nutrition authorizations and so forth. And I think that, you know, as we talked about before, there's just going to be a strong effort in working with both sides of the aisle and trying to get bipartisan solutions to these issues.
Darcy Vetter, I may ask you this question. This one comes from Steve Coulter. I believe I said that right. Asking about what incentives could be used. How should the USDA be part of the change in driving more nutritious eating? What incentives could be used? Your thoughts on that topic?
I guess it's a good question. I mean, again, I think that there are a number of places where USDA touches people throughout their lives in terms of nutritious eating. And one of them, of course, is through the school lunches. And I think that eating habits are formed by, you know, children at that age. And so making sure that they are exposed to and have the opportunity to choose and develop those habits throughout their lifetime is one way to really influence more nutritious eating. You know, there are things that have been done through SNAP, like double up food bucks that allow SNAP dollars to go twice as far when spent on fresh fruits and vegetables, you know, focusing on access to fresh fruits and vegetables. One issue I've been watching with a bit of concern actually is, you know, again, food deserts, access to food has been, you know, an issue that people have talked about in terms of just having a neighborhood full service grocery available to most of the population, while COVID itself has, of course, made SNAP benefits even more important in reaching people who may be unemployed due to COVID, who may feel vulnerable or may take risks to be out physically shopping, and so have started to be able to use those benefits to order their groceries. But only a certain number, usually a very large chains, are able to actually allow for that SNAP usage of those SNAP dollars on their platform. And so sort of an inadvertent effect of, you know, allowing that online purchasing may mean that local stores are not benefiting from those SNAP dollars. And so, you know, thinking about other incentives that may be discouraging on the other side and what can be done, you know, to make sure that those important supports for nutrition in communities, that we understand the effects and can assist them. So, I mean, those are just issues that I'm watching, but, you know, again, where USDA touches people every day in many different ways because of the breadth of the department, how can we use those touches to encourage the kinds of practices that promote health and nutrition?
There's just a whole host of great questions that we're probably not going to get to all of them. I may try to ask this one. I think it's kind of interesting. This was requested to be kind of asked without a name, but increased industry conservation has been ongoing for the past 40 years across food and agriculture. It's part driven by technology, economies of scale, also driven by some policy decisions at the FTC and DOJ. Do we expect any changes in some of that policy and consolidation, monopoly type pursuits in this next administration? What approaches might this new administration take to address this? And Secretary Glickman, I might throw this your way.
It's a very good question. There's been consolidation, not just in agriculture, but almost in every field: banking, transportation, you know, airlines, you name it. Certainly in agriculture, we've seen a lot in crop inputs, and we've certainly seen it in the protein business. Part of it is just the economies of scale. So yeah, I know that the Biden administration has talked about increasing antitrust enforcement. It's always a complicated thing to do, but I think that they should, in fact, look at this entire issue. And we have a statute in USDA called the Grain and Stockyards Inspection, the GIPSA statute, which allows Packers and Stockyards Act inspection to look at concentration in the meatpacking industry. So yes, I think we ought to look at it, but I also think we need to develop alternatives for new forms of agriculture. So farmers markets have been the fastest growing part of agriculture, organic agriculture, indoor agriculture, and new products for consumer taste. So, I mean, I wish there was a magic answer to this particular problem of concentration. There isn't, unfortunately.
Sure. One more question here. I want to throw this out there really quick. George Plavin with the Capitol Press, Salem, Oregon. What do you expect the administration to do from a farm labor policy perspective? Secretary Veneman, maybe we go to you first and then come back, and we may have to make this our last question.
I think it's hard to say. I mean, clearly we continue to rely a great deal on guest workers coming in from mostly Mexico to harvest a lot of our crops. I think there's going to be a continued need to address those issues. But I think that we need to look at labor in the broader sense that we were talking about much earlier in this overall discussion. And that is, we've really identified essential workers throughout COVID as being almost anybody in the food chain. So the grocery workers, are they protected enough? The people that are harvesting the products, as I said before, the dangers of COVID while you're living in too close quarters is even worse than working in the fields. The people working in the meat processing plants, as we've talked about. So I think worker availability is going to have to be combined with worker safety as we go forward. We just can't look anymore at the ag worker just as the availability. We also have to look at safety. If I can just make a comment on the last two questions as well. On the nutrition issue, I think we've really got to look very carefully at how do we really, and Dan Glickman and I have done a lot of work through the Bipartisan Policy Center on this. How do we really look at nutrition in a way in our programs so that they are used to help people live healthier lives? And so we've had proposals about making the SNAP program look more like the WIC program, where you really are buying healthier product. We made a proposal, it didn't get in the last farm bill, even as a proposal, that we start this process by eliminating soft drinks from the SNAP program. They have no nutritional benefit. On the school lunch side, we have both the school lunch standards that were implemented in the Obama administration that have been kind of backpedaled on in this administration. I think that's going to have to be looked at. As Darcy said, school lunch is really, if you can get kids to eat better in school in their younger days, they're less likely to get diet-related diseases later on. And I think that there also has been a lot of discussion around the fact that all schools now are entitled to give free school lunch from their school premises while kids are working from home. I think there's going to be a lot of discussion about whether or not we should make all school lunches free in the future. And then on outlets for product, as Dan said, farmers markets, indoor agriculture, all of these are important, as well as you saw during COVID, a lot more people going to local agriculture to source their food for cooking at home. So there's been a huge increase in CSAs, or community supported agriculture, these boxes that people buy directly from farmers, which is a great way for smaller acreage farmers to really make a living. I think you also have, I think the other thing we've seen a need for through COVID is the need for smaller meat plants, because people have bought an animal and they want to slaughter and there's no place to do that. And I think the federal government and the state government need to work together to figure out how to make more opportunities for those kinds of people that want to buy, one or two animals, to have a place where they can actually have it slaughtered.
All those great points. Thank you so much for sharing those insights and sharing that with the entire group. I want to turn it over to Sherry. I know we're about to run out of time before we get too far or too close to the end of our time, and let her do some closing goodbyes. I really appreciate it. I thought it was a great discussion. Lots of good topics here. Of course, plenty more to address, as you can see the list of questions that we weren't able to get to. Thank you so much for having me, and thank you to the panel.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great. So as we reach the end of our time, I'd like to say thank you once again to Clinton and our wonderful panelists and Bill Flory for their contributions today. And thank you all for joining us and submitting your questions. It's been an honor and a privilege to host this discussion. We so appreciate your engagement with us today, and we'd love to hear your feedback. So please just take a minute to share your comments about today's session in the brief survey you'll see at the conclusion of this forum. Please watch your email and social media for information about our next Farm Foundation Forum, which will be in February 2021. We look forward to seeing you then as we begin a new year together. Thank you once again for your engagement today.